Okay, patterns of subsistence. We are going to be talking about the various ways in which societies organize themselves economically. And this is one of the ways that people may meet their basic needs. We were talking about basic needs early on in the class. So the book that you're using, I believe, breaks up all different patterns of subsistence into five categories. Most books do four or five. I'm actually going to do six, and I'm going to do foraging, pastoral, horticultural, agricultural, industrial, and post industrial. And I'm not going to focus a lot on post industrial, but I think it's worth mentioning in order to get you thinking about this stuff because it's going to be important in your lives, but not necessarily in this class, okay? So why anthropologists study modes of subsistence. Sorry, before I go on, modes of subsistence and mode of production are pretty much synonyms. We're going to be using those interchangeably. Your book uses the term mode of subsistence, I believe, but if I accidentally say mode of production every once in a while, that's a term that Karl Marx uses. That's a perfectly good substitution, and they're really very similar. So the reason anthropologists study economics, because like gender or language, it's one of those basic building blocks of a culture that you can learn a ton about another place just by knowing what their mode of subsistence is. So there are patterns. There are patterns of gender hierarchy, of social structure, of technological advancement that are associated with each of these six different modes of subsistence. And so, if you were to tell me, oh, I'm an anthropologist and I just jumped out of an airplane and helicoptered into, parachuted into this culture, and they are an intensive agricultural society, I could tell you some broad outlines about that culture that would likely be true. Now, also realize that this is on a spectrum. So there's not very many cultures or societies that are 100% foraging. And there's not very many societies that are 100% industrial. Most societies are a sort of somewhere on this scale, okay? It's a sliding scale. So again, we're going to be talking about foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, intensive agriculture, post industrialism, and then post industrialism. And these are pretty much historically uh, accurate in terms of they're linear in terms of when people first started participating in these modes of production. So humans spent the vast majority of our evolutionary history as foragers. Okay, sometimes foragers are called hunter and gatherers, but I'm going to push back on that, and I don't really like the term hunter and gatherer for a lot of reasons. So nowadays, most anthropologists use the term foragers. So we've spent millions and millions of years as foragers, and before we were even humans, when we were proto-humans, which we'll learn about a lot if you take the biological anthropology courses, or even apes, there are most of them are foragers. So uh, foraging is really built into our DNA, and a lot of the interesting social problems we have, especially with like our diet today in our industrial, post-industrial society that we live today, a lot of those problems are because so much of our culture and our biology is adapted to a foraging lifestyle. So, foraging, as a definition, also known as hunting and gathering, but I'm going to try to steer away from that, is the production of food by collecting wild, undomesticated animals and plants. Okay? Not domesticated animals and plants, wild plants. Humans spend the vast majority of our existence as foragers. So, foraging, I'm using that term instead of hunter gatherer, is preferred today because hunting and gathering gives equal weight to meat from hunting and plants that are gathered. So, in most foraging communities, not all, but usually the men will be the hunters and women will do the foraging. Not always, though. I almost said hunting and gathering. Some foraging societies, women do hunting, and in actually most foraging societies, men also work in gathering. But um, it tends to be in foraging societies that a very small portion of their caloric intake, the actual calories they get from food, is from hunting. Hunting is very difficult. You're not very guaranteed to bring back meat, and so only like 10% or less of their actual total amount of calories comes from hunting. Most of the food comes from gathering. And so if you call them hunters gatherers, then you're putting this big emphasis on the work of men and what men are doing hunting, when actually it's sort of outsized. Women are doing the vast majority of food collection most of the time, but not always. Okay, these are broad generalizations. So also another characterization of foraging that is incorrect that you might have heard, Thomas Hobbes called foragers or hunters and gatherers as nasty. He described their lives, excuse me, as nasty, brutish, and short. So you might think of foragers as constantly on the edge of dying, just a very very harsh existence. You catch a cold or you break your leg and then you just die because there's no medicine and no one to help you. But a lot of those characterizations as the caveman lifestyle is just not true. So you might have heard before that foragers or hunter and gatherers have these very very low mortality life expectancies, something like 33 years or 40 years life expectancy, and that's true. That's the average age that they might live, but that's not doesn't mean that there weren't older people. The reason that number is so low is because they had very very high infant mortality rates. So a lot of our technological advancement recently has been being able to keep more and more infants alive. We have much higher infant mortality rates. So when a baby dies after being just a few days old, then that brings that total average of life expectancy way down. But for even for hunter gatherers and for foragers, if they were able to survive infancy and they made it to puberty, more than likely they would make it into their 60s or even 70s. So they didn't have these really, really short life expectancies that you might glean from just looking at the average age of death. And also, they didn't very work that hard because this is a time when there's not very high population density. Most foragers had a lot of territory and they walked around and roamed very large territories without bumping into other groups of humans very often. And so they didn't have to work very hard. You think about it, you just literally walk into the forest and collect the food that you're going to eat. And they had very simple houses, and a lot of the times they didn't even have permanent houses. They would just move around from day to day and camp and sleep wherever they ended up at the end of the evening. And so they only worked 20 to 30 hours a week. And so it wasn't this really harsh lifestyle that some people might think. Don't worry about the work to play dichotomy, we'll just skip that. So some of the characterizations that you might glean from if you just told me that some group of people were foragers is I would probably guess that their gender relationships, the relationship between men and women, is relatively egalitarian. Like I said, in most foraging societies, hunting is like not that big of a deal. People do go on these hunting expeditions, and when they get meat, the meat is very prized because they don't eat a lot of meat. But most people gather food, and they don't really have strict gender distinctions in terms of what kind of men and women doing different kinds of labor or work. So they're relatively egalitarian. Their political system is very decentralized and shared and highly mobile. So there may be somebody who's kind of sort of in charge of the group, but that doesn't mean that they have absolute power, and they're not really elected. A lot of people don't really want to be the responsible person in the group, and there's not a big broad political system or anything like that. And the group structure is they're small bands, so people of less than 100 people, where you know all of the people. You're intimately familiar with all of the different people that you're moving around with. And these groups would also shift a lot. Sometimes groups of 10 or 20 would come together briefly, and then they would split off again, maybe mixing up differently. So it was very fluid. Now, you don't have to know every single piece of all this information, but it's good to have a broad outline, a general understanding.